Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? She sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, the polished mahogany surface before her gleaming under the lights of the Naval Operations Command Auditorium. To her left and right, decorated officers exchanged nods and practiced smiles. The atmosphere buzzed with pride, ceremony, and whispers, but none of them looked at her. Not directly. Her name was printed third on the program. Lieutenant Eva Callahan, Navy Cross recipient, hero of Operation High Torch. To most in the room, she was already a symbol, to a few, a myth. But to the man sitting front and center, Admiral Marcus Lee, she was a question mark, a name that refused to leave his thoughts. He'd read her file a dozen times in the past week. Read it again that morning. Everything added up. Everything looked clean. But that was the problem. He'd been in command long enough to know when something was too clean. When Ava's name was called, the room fell into a hush so deep it felt sacred. No cheers, no murmurs. Just a slow, collective breath, as if even the walls were listening. She stood, straight-backed, precise. The metals on her uniform didn't clink. Her eyes didn't search the crowd. Her hands didn't tremble. She walked to the stage as if reporting for routine duty, not to receive one of the Navy's highest honors. The announcer spoke in careful tones, sanitized phrases, extraordinary heroism, enemy engagement, extraction under fire. But the real story, the one that had haunted Admiral Lee since he'd first seen her name, remained buried beneath the rehearsed words. Ava took the medal without flinching, saluted sharply, held her expression like stone. When Lee stepped forward to shake her hand, he felt it, not strength, not confidence, but something heavier, something like restraint. She wasn't proud. She was enduring. "Congratulations, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "Thank you, sir," she replied. Just as quiet. He almost asked her then, almost pulled her aside. What really happened in that jungle? But this wasn't the place. The cameras flashed, applause rolled. She returned to her seat like nothing had happened, but he watched her. And she didn't clap for the next honoree. She just sat, still, silent, waiting. After the ceremony, the room loosened, officers mingled, families took pictures, glasses clinked. But Eva stayed alone, the way some soldiers do when their bodies return, but their minds are still on foreign soil. Lee approached her as the crowd thinned. "Lieutenant Callahan." She turned, saluted. "Sir, walk with me." She hesitated for half a second, then followed him down a quiet corridor, lined with portraits of men and women who'd never made it back. "You refused this medal once," he said as they walked. "I did, sir. Why accept it now?" She stopped in front of a framed photo, a young face, frozen in time. "Because I thought no one cared enough to ask why." Her voice was flat, not defiant, not bitter, just tired. The kind of tired you couldn't sleep off. The kind you carry in your bones. "I read your file," he said, "but I know how files can lie." "They don't lie, sir," she answered. "They just leave things out." He studied her, trying to see what the words on the page had missed. She looked the same as the photos, only more real, more worn. "I authorized that mission," he said. "Covert insertion, Solomon Islands, like resistance expected. Recon and recovery." "You remember wrong," she said, eyes forward. Lee stopped walking. "How?" She turned to face him fully, and for the first time, he saw it. The flicker in her gaze, raw, undiluted, something buried deep but alive. "We were sent into a trap, Admiral," she said. "We weren't supposed to come back." The words hit him like a slap. "You think the mission was compromised?" "I don't think," she said. "I know." There was a pause. The hum of distant conversation echoed faintly from the ceremony hall, but between them, silence reigned. "If you really want to know why I didn't want the medal," she glanced toward a nearby door, "you need to see what it cost." He followed her without a word, down another corridor, through a security door, into a small windowless briefing room. No cameras, no recordings, just white walls and a table. She stood at the far end, her hands resting on the table's edge. "I haven't been in this room since the debrief," she said, voice softer now. Funny how places hold echoes. Lee stayed silent. He didn't know what she was about to show him, only that it would stay with him forever. Then she turned slowly. Deliberately, she unbuttoned her dress blouse. Her undershirt clung tightly to her skin, and with measured calm, she raised it just high enough to reveal the right side of her torso. Lee felt his breath catch. The scars were brutal. Twisting lines of healed tissue and discolored skin. They weren't the kind done by a surgeon's hand. These were field injuries, battlefield medicine done in the dirt, fractured ribs, torn muscle. Under the skin, two small, hard lumps pressed outward, metal fragments still embedded. Ava dropped the shirt, buttoned her uniform again, sat across from him. "They ache during storms," she said. "Sometimes during PT, most days, I forget they're there. Until ceremonies like this." Lee leaned forward, his voice low. "Why didn't they remove them?" "They're too close to my lungs. Surgery could puncture them," he swallowed. "You live with that every day?" She nodded, but it's not the pain that's hard to live with. It's the silence. He looked down. The metal in his hand suddenly felt like lead. "It wasn't just the ambush," she said. "It was what came after." Lee raised his eyes. She was staring straight at him now. "I woke up in Guam," she continued. "No debrief. No investigation, just a promotion, a nurse, and a mailed medal. You weren't interviewed?" His brows drew together. "Once, by a captain I'd never met. 3 questions. Then he left." Lee clenched his jaw. "That's not protocol." "No," she said. "That's damage control." The silence thickened. He thought of the mission. Order, the satellite data, everything that had come through his office. He remembered it being routine and quiet. But nothing about this woman in front of him was routine. "How did you know it was a setup?" he asked. "I didn't, not at first." Her eyes darkened. "But when the ambush came, they moved like they'd rehearsed it. They boxed us in from angles no scout could guess. They knew exactly where we'd land. And when did you report your suspicions?" Her bitter smile was answer enough. "Who was I going to tell?" She said, "The man who signed the orders?" That one cut deeper than she meant it to. Lee felt it, took it, sat with it. "I took the blame," she continued, "not officially, but in spirit. My silence let them spin a story. Courage under fire, heroic extraction. They needed a headline. I gave them one. And the men you saved? They don't know the full truth, just that I pulled them out." Lee exhaled slowly. "Why? Tell me now." She paused, looked down at the table, then back up. "Because I saw your eyes during that ceremony," she said. "You weren't clapping for the headline. You wanted to know the woman behind it." A long silence followed. Then she added, voice lower still, "And because I'm tired, Admiral. Tired of pretending these scars mean glory, when they're really just survival." He nodded, slowly, gravely. "And I don't want medals for surviving something I was never meant to." "What do you want?" he asked. Her answer came softly, but it carried the weight of a decade. "I want accountability. How do you carry a body 3 miles through the jungle while bleeding from your ribs?" That question had echoed in Ava's mind every night since the mission. She had never answered it aloud. She wasn't sure she could. The helicopter blades had. Thundered overhead that night, slicing through the humid air as the team dropped into darkness. No sound but breath. No light but night vision flickers. Their boots hit the soil in silence. 5 shadows in tight formation. The briefing had been clear. Extraction only, low risk, no expected hostiles. Lieutenant Eva Callahan had led a dozen missions before, but something about this one made her stomach twist. Not fear. She knew fear well. This was different. The jungle was too still. The GPS signal, supposedly attached to Doctor, Tomas Vera's collar was moving. Too smoothly, too predictably, like it was being walked, not worn. She tapped her mic. Team Bravo, this is Callahan. Proceed with caution. This might not be what it looks like. They didn't get far. The night exploded. Mines, gunfire, flares. Trees shattered. The soil erupted beneath them. Bullets sliced through the air. One of her men dropped before he screamed. Her comms officer, throat gone before his knees hit the dirt. Ambush. She shouted, diving behind a fallen trunk. Take cover. The jungle roared. Screams, heat, blinding flashes. She scrambled to Ruiz. His leg pouring blood, she dragged him behind a ridge, just in time to dodge another blast that hurled her against the ground like a rag doll. A flash of heat, then agony. Something tore through her side. A shard of steel, deep. She couldn't even scream. The breath caught in her throat like fire. She pressed a hand to her ribs. It came away wet, soaking. She should have blacked out. But Ruiz was still breathing. She moved. She lifted him with one arm, gritting her teeth against the scream, trying to crawl from her lungs. Another soldier, Franks, was crawling, one arm dangling. She went back for him. Then Kim. By the time they reached the edge of the tree line, Ava's legs were trembling so badly she had to crawl the final yards on her stomach, dragging the last body across the wet grass. She remembered almost nothing of the 3-mile trek. Just flashes, moonlight on leaves, breaths that sounded like drowning, a sleeve bitten into silence. At one point, she thought her lungs had stopped. She coughed blood into her collar. The pain was no longer pain. It was electricity, but they made it. Dawn was coming when she saw the black silhouette of the Navy SEAL medic running toward them. Jesus Christ, he gasped. What happened? Ava's lips barely moved. They're alive. Take them. Then everything went black. She woke up in a hospital in Guam, chest bandaged, tubes in her arm, oxygen in her nose. Her throat burned like she'd swallowed fire. A nurse sat beside her, moist, gentle. You had internal bleeding, broken ribs. We had to stabilize you fast. 2 pieces of shrapnel are still inside, too close to your lungs. The doctor says they'll stay. Ava lifted her hand, wrote on the chart beside her. How? Many made it? The nurse smiled, sadly. 3. Thanks to you. 3. Out of 6. She should have felt relief. She felt empty. Command sent a courier with a medal recommendation. No interview, no questions, just a form. 1 checkmark from being turned into a recruiting poster. When her CO finally visited, he brought the medal in person. You've earned it. Callahan, he said. She looked him in the eye. Who gave the mission order? He froze. Why does it matter? It was a setup, she said. He said nothing. She tore the form in half, sent the medal back. Her silence began that day. Not from fear, but futility. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a narrative, too. Months later, her body was healed enough to return to base. But the woman inside the uniform wasn't whole. She moved like a ghost. She trained recruits, filed reports. Ate alone, promotions came. She didn't attend the ceremonies. Once a week, she sat in the gym, staring at the same 2 photos on the wall. Her squad. And her squad after. That was the before and after no one wanted to talk about. Some of the men she saved visited her. Ruiz cried the first time. You dragged me, Ava, he said. You didn't leave me. She hugged him, said nothing. He never saw the tears after he left. The metal in her ribs never shifted. The pain came in waves. Most days she could ignore it, but during storms, it ached like the jungle was clawing its way back inside her. She stopped visiting the base counselor after 2 sessions. He asked the wrong questions. Did you feel fear? Do you think you're suffering from trauma? She wanted to ask him if he knew what it was like to wake up and feel metal inside you. Not bullets, not metals, just proof that someone let you bleed for nothing. One afternoon, during a training exercise, a cadet approached her. barely 20, wide-eyed. "Ma'am, is it true what they say? About the jungle op? That you carried 3 men out? That you didn't even cry?" Eva looked at the girl. She was what Eva had once been, hopeful. "Oh," I cried, she said, more soft. "Just not where anyone could see it. Back in the present, in that quiet briefing room with Admiral Lee. Eva said none of this, but she didn't have to. He could see it now. The weight, the truth she carried like armor." He sat across from her, hands trembling, the Navy Cross still in his hand. "I've seen combat injuries," he said, "but that's different." She nodded. "They're not battle scars. They're secrets. Secrets I didn't ask to keep. I gave that order," he said again. But now the words tasted sour. "I trusted the intel, the data, the chain." She looked up, and someone in that chain sold us out. A long silence stretched between them. Lee stood, walked to the small window, stared out at the city lights. He'd spent his career believing in the system, believing the numbers, the files, the missions. But numbers didn't bleed. Files didn't carry men through mud with broken ribs. "Do you think there's still a leak?" he asked. She didn't flinch. "I think there was, maybe still is. But someone sent us into that jungle, knowing we wouldn't make it back." Lee nodded slowly. "I can open an internal review quietly, pull the mission record, look at satellite logs." Eva stood. "That's all I ask." She walked to the door, then stopped. "You asked why I stayed in uniform," she said. He turned. "Because the uniform didn't fail me. People did, and I'm not going to let them be the only ones wearing it." She left. The door clicked shut behind her. Admiral Marcus Lee remained seated, staring at the scarred chair she'd left behind, and in that silence, something shifted. She wasn't a hero. Not the kind they put on posters. She was something real, a survivor with a voice, and for the first time, he realized if he didn't listen now, he'd be part of the silence that nearly killed her. What does it take for truth to become louder than the lie? The next morning, Admiral Marcus Lee sat alone in his office. A thick file sat open on his desk. Lieutenant Eva Callahan. Commendations, promotion records, operation briefs. It was supposed to tell her story. But after last night, it felt more like a cover. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the city skyline, ships moving across the bay, a carrier being loaded for deployment. Beneath it all, a silence hummed, the kind that hides behind routine, the kind people mistake for order. He picked up the phone. "I want a full reevaluation of Operation High Torch," he said. "Pull internal comms, classified and unclassified. Every data feed prior to deployment. I'll sign the override myself." Pause, sir. That operation was closed 2 years ago. The directive. "I don't care about directives," Lee said. "Reopen the case." He hung up. 10 minutes later, his aide entered the room. "Sir, Lieutenant Callahan is in the building." She came, unannounced. "Should I send her in?" Eva walked in like she belonged there. No hesitation, no ceremony. Her uniform was crisp, her face unreadable. But he could tell something had shifted. She looked clearer, like carrying the truth, even for a single day, had changed the weight of it. "I figured you'd have questions," she said. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. "You said someone compromised your mission," he began. "That it was deliberate." Eva nodded once. "Yes, sir. Have you told anyone else?" She shook her head. "No. If I had, I wouldn't still be in uniform." He raised a brow. "You think it would've gone that far?" She met his eyes. If someone was willing to sacrifice 6 American lives for unknown reasons, what do you think they'd do to the one who lived? He didn't respond immediately, but he didn't argue. Inside the ranks, there were things you didn't say aloud, not because they weren't true, but because they were too big, too dangerous. The world outside saw medals and footage. Inside, there were shadows, quiet manipulations buried beneath flags. "You believe there was a leak," he said. "Do you know who?" Ava took a breath. "No, but I have theories. It had to be someone high enough to override ground protocols, high enough to redirect satellite data." Lee opened a folder on his desk, slid a few documents toward her. "I reopened the mission. Record this morning. There's a timestamp anomaly 40 minutes before your deployment. A distress signal was intercepted from your landing zone, but the file was backdated. I never saw it." Ava's eyes narrowed. 40 minutes before? Yes, someone changed the time logs, then greenlit the mission anyway. She leaned back, the truth sinking deeper. They almost got away with it. "There's more," Lee said. He opened another file. Inside, a grainy black and white satellite. Image, coordinates, a signature, a redacted name. Dr. Tomas Vera, the scientist your team was supposed to extract, was already dead before your boots hit the ground. Ava's head snapped toward him. "What?" "He died 3 days earlier. The intel was fabricated. The GPS beacon was staged." The words landed like a fist to the gut. Then what the hell was the mission? She whispered. Lee took a long breath. It was a test run for a new satellite-guided drone targeting system. Your team was the control variable. They wanted to track real-time soldier movement in a high-risk environment and measure the algorithm's prediction accuracy. Eva stared at him, stunned. "They used us." "Yes," he said, quiet, honest. She stood, pacing, her fists clenched at her sides. "They sacrificed my team for a tech demo?" Lee looked down, and then covered it up by painting you as a hero. She slammed her hand against the desk. "They knew I'd survive?" "They hoped you wouldn't," he said. "But if you did, a clean narrative, courage under fire, heroic recovery, perfect spin." Ava's breath shook. "I should have spoken up sooner." "You did what you could," Lee said. "You carried the mission. You protected your team. You stayed silent to shield them. That's not failure, Lieutenant. That's leadership." She turned back to him, fire still in her voice. "So what now?" "I'm escalating it to the Inspector General," he said, quietly. "No headlines yet. But someone is going to answer for this." Eva said again, calmer now, but her eyes burned. "And the truth?" she asked. "Will it ever come out?" Lee paused. "Truth is like pressure," he said. "You can keep it contained for a while, but eventually it breaks through." She nodded, slowly. "Then I'll wait." His eyes dropped for a moment to her chest, not out of indecency, but memory, where the metal had been pinned, where the pain still lived. "How's the pain?" he asked. She smirked faintly. "Always there, but today it hurts less." Lee reached into a drawer, pulled out a small box. "This isn't protocol," he said. "It doesn't even exist yet." He opened it. Inside was a silver emblem, simple, sharp, and new. "The Integrity Star," he said. "Drafted it this morning. Only one in existence. It's not for courage under fire. It's for those who choose the harder truth over the easier lie." He stood, pinned it to her chest. No cameras, no reporters, no speeches. Just truth and silence. And respect. And in that quiet moment, Marcus Lee finally saw her, not as a story, or a soldier, or a myth, but as what she truly was, the one who came back when she wasn't supposed to, and still had the strength to speak. What does a scar say when words aren't enough? The hallway outside Admiral Lee's office was quiet, but inside Eva, everything was loud. Her heartbeat, the memory of the jungle, the ache beneath her ribs. She had always believed the body remembers. Pain even when the mind tries to forget. Today proved it. The Integrity Star rested lightly on her uniform, but it carried something heavier than metal. Acknowledgement, not for heroics, for endurance, for truth. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt exposed, but she wasn't hiding anymore. As she walked toward the infirmary for a scheduled scan, A group of junior officers passed her, whispering, "That's her." One murmured, "The jungle op girl." Ava didn't flinch. She was used to being a ghost in uniform. Too real for rumor. Too legendary for comfort. Her scars were invisible beneath the jacket, but they walked with her, spoke louder than the hushes behind her. Later that afternoon, Admiral Lee convened a private meeting. 5 officers in a secure conference room deep within Naval Command. No notes, no leaks, just truth. Ava sat at the end of the long table, composed but alert. This time, she didn't wait to be asked. She stood, unbuttoned her jacket. Then her undershirt, just enough to reveal the landscape across her ribs. Gasps rippled softly. One officer's eyes widened, another looked away. "These are shrapnel wounds," Ava said. "From Operation High Torch. 2 fragments are still inside. The rest were removed in Guam. I was told the mission was an extraction. But it wasn't. We now know it was a live weapons test. My team was the bait." The JAG officer, Commander Darnell, shifted uncomfortably. "We've reviewed the preliminary findings. Timestamp tampering was confirmed. A data feed was rerouted through a private defense tech firm, Orion Systems." Ava nodded. "That's the name I saw in the satellite logs." Orion was subcontracted to test a thermal drone guidance protocol. Another officer chimed in. "But the drones never arrived. They weren't supposed to," Admiral Lee said. "The objective wasn't recovery. It was observation, tracking, real-time soldier movement under stress, to refine predictive pathing algorithms." Someone cursed under their breath. "You mean?" Darnell blinked. "They sent live soldiers into a hostile zone just to collect movement data?" "Yes," Ava said. "And when we were attacked, they let it play out." The IG representative, a thin woman named Holborn, leaned forward. Her tone was razor sharp. "That's enough for a criminal investigation. Potential charges include unauthorized operations, falsification of records, and negligent homicide." Admiral Lee nodded. "We're not burying this." "No, sir," Holborn agreed. "But we'll need an official statement from Lieutenant Callahan." Eva paused. She had imagined this moment, when the silence would finally break, when she'd speak the truth, not in a whisper or behind closed doors, but on record, for history. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like release. "I'll give you my statement," she said. As the officers rose to leave, one lingered behind. Commander Rizzo, older, calm. "I served in Helmand," he said quietly. "Lost good men to a bad call. I've never had the guts to say what you just did." Eva met his eyes. "You still can." He gave a faint, weary smile. "Maybe now." Outside, the clouds were rolling in. The sky hung heavy over the capital like judgment waiting to fall. Ava walked back to her barracks alone. Halfway there, a sharp twinge pulsed in her side. The shrapnel reminded her it was still there, still watching. She stopped, pressed a hand over her ribs. It hurt, but not like before. That night, she stood in front of the mirror, shirt off, the dim bedside lamp casting soft shadows across her skin. The scars were jagged, raw in places, but they were no longer secrets. They were evidence, and now they were speaking. The next morning, the Naval Review Board gathered inside a high-security conference chamber. Senior officers, legal advisors, civilian defense liaisons. The mood had shifted. This wasn't ceremony. It was confrontation. At the head of the table sat Vice Admiral Penrose, former overseer of South Pacific procurement. Ava knew the name. She'd read it in redacted memos. He was the one who'd signed the Orion Systems contract. "I don't see the purpose of revisiting a closed file from 2 years ago," Penrose said. Arms crossed. Admiral Lee's voice was calm, measured. "The purpose is accountability." Eva entered the room. This time, no whispers, no second glances. They knew who she was. She wore her formal blues, a ribbon bar perfectly aligned, chin high, eyes clear. She wasn't a myth anymore. She was. The whistleblower, Penrose, barely looked up. Lieutenant Callahan, I've reviewed your file. What you endured was unfortunate, but wartime missions carry risk. Eva stepped forward. With respect, sir. It wasn't war. It was betrayal. The room stilled, like a drop pin would echo. The coordinates we received were accurate, she continued, but not for extraction. They placed us directly into enemy hands. The opposition knew we were coming, because someone told them. Murmurs, a flicker of unease. Penrose narrowed his eyes. And how can you be certain? Ava opened a folder, pulled out 3 documents, decrypted satellite logs, rerouted timestamps, and a memo with a matching mission code. This, she said, is a transmission between Orion Systems and a Navy data relay contractor. It was sent 11 hours before we deployed, with our field ID embedded. Penrose glanced at the page. His tone hardened. You weren't cleared to access these files. I know, she said, but I had to show you the truth. You violated protocol, Lee cut in, his voice razor-sharp. You're focusing on clearance, Admiral, when you should be focused on content. Penrose opened his mouth to protest. But Eva wasn't finished. She pulled out a photo. Blurry, grainy, but clear enough. A group of insurgents unloading crates marked with the Orion Systems subcontractor logo. The enemy received our tech, Eva said, directly or through a proxy. And then they used our presence to stress test a combat algorithm. Penrose stood. These are accusations. They're evidence. Admiral Lee snapped. And we've already initiated a joint investigation with the Department of Defense and NCIS. Formal inquiry begins tomorrow. Penrose's voice. Rose, you're overstepping your command. Eva stepped closer, calm, measured. No, sir. We're finally doing what command is supposed to do. Protect its people. The room fell into a long, uneasy silence. Some officers leaned forward. Others looked away. The tide had turned that evening. Eva sat alone on a park bench across from the Potomac. The water shimmered in gold under the twilight. The air was crisp, clean. It was the first breath she'd taken in months that didn't feel like it burned. You should have been a lawyer. She turned. Admiral Lee stood behind her, coffee in one hand, a sealed envelope in the other. Eva smiled faintly. I've had a lot of practice arguing with walls. He handed her the envelope. Inside was a letter, Navy letterhead. Her name at the top, one word in bold, cleared. I filed an early immunity motion, he said. For accessing the files, you won't face charges. She blinked. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, he said. You protected the uniform more fiercely than most people who wear it their whole careers. She looked down at the river. The weight in her chest shifted. Not gone, but moving. I thought if I told the truth, they'd silence me. They tried, Lee said. But you made sure your scars spoke louder than their secrets. He started to walk away, then paused. You're not done yet, he said. She looked at him. Meaning? People are going to look at you differently. Some will admire you. Some will hate you. But most will follow you. He met her eyes. You've got more to teach than combat tactics. Ava didn't respond right away. Finally, she asked, what if I'm not ready? You are, he said, because you didn't survive to be silent. You survived to lead. What happens when your survival becomes a threat to the system? Weeks passed, and the storm Eva had set in motion was no longer behind closed doors. It had a name now, Project Cold Trail, and it echoed across defense channels like a tremor. No one could contain. Orion Systems was under investigation. 2 senior Navy officers had been placed on administrative leave. The Office of the Inspector General confirmed timestamp tampering, improper tech transfers, and multiple deviations from standard operating protocols, but none of it was enough. Not yet. One morning, as Eva approached the base's officer mess hall, a group of cadets outside straightened to attention when they saw her. One of them, barely 20, freckles across her cheeks, saluted with trembling fingers. "Ma'am," she said, voice catching. "Thank you for not letting them bury." Eva nodded, her throat suddenly tight. She was getting used to being thanked for surviving something she never volunteered to endure. Later that day, Admiral Lee's assistant handed her a sealed folder. "From the Admiral, Lieutenant. You're cleared to review this personally." She opened it on the bench outside his office. Inside, a redeployment request. Not combat, not disciplinary. Advisory. She was being reassigned to a newly formed reform task force attached to a classified defense council focused on ethical oversight of contractor-integrated missions. She would act as a field voice among policymakers, not a symbol, a participant. She closed the folder slowly. They weren't sidelining her. They were elevating her. But was she ready to carry this fight into the heart of the system? That afternoon, she walked into Admiral Lee's office. He stood by the window, reading a memo. Without turning, he said, "Knew you'd come. You want me to help fix it?" She asked. He turned to face her. "No, I want you to help rebuild it." She held the folder in both hands. "That system almost killed me. That's why it needs someone who survived it," he said. "Someone who understands what truth costs." She hesitated. "What if they don't listen?" "They will," he said. "Because if they don't, you'll make sure they do." That night, Eva visited an old friend, Sergeant Malik Bennett, the last man from her team still alive. They hadn't spoken in nearly a year. He met her outside. A small veteran center just off base. His limp was worse now. His burns, visible on the side of his neck, still raw, but his eyes hadn't dimmed. "I saw the hearings," he said. "You were a force." Eva gave a tired smile. "I wish we'd all made it back," Malik nodded slowly. "I do too, but you made it mean something. That's more than I could have hoped." She reached into her jacket and handed him a folder, her full statement. "It's all here, every lie, every thread." He took it, gently. His hands, scarred but steady, held it like something sacred. "You still carry the guilt?" he asked. She didn't look away. "Every day." He leaned back, looked up at the stars. "Then carry it like armor. You're the reason they'll think twice next time." They sat in silence. Not the painful kind, the kind that held peace. Next week, Eva boarded a flight to D.C., destination Pentagon. She was met at the gates by Secretary of Defense Langston himself, a rare gesture. He'd read her file, watched her testimony, requested her by name. "We've built an entire combat doctrine around tech partnerships," he said as they walked. "That's not the issue. The issue is when those partnerships override human judgment." He looked at her, direct, no spin. "We need fail-safes, and we need warfighters like you helping shape them." Eva didn't respond immediately. Langston continued. "They'll tell you policy isn't personal. But you and I both know it always is." Eva met his eyes. "Then let's make it personal for the right reasons." The meetings that followed were tense. Generals, contractors, engineers, lobbyists, people who lived behind strategy charts and satellite screens. They weren't used to someone like her, someone whose body still carried the cost of their decisions. On the second day, a senior executive from a defense tech firm cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Lieutenant Callahan, war is unpredictable. Collateral risk is part of the calculus." Eva didn't blink. "You call it calculus," she said. "I call it 37 minutes on the jungle floor, watching my teammates die while your algorithm stalled." The room went silent. She pressed forward. "You want better AI? Better drones? Fine, but stop treating soldiers like variables. You don't optimize for survival from a spreadsheet." Someone in the back whispered, "She's not wrong." The shift had begun. Each night, Eva returned to her hotel room, exhausted. Her ribs ached from the air conditioning. The scars felt tight, but she traced them anyway, not because they hurt, because they reminded her why she was here. One night, she sat cross-legged on her bed, tablet in hand, reviewing a draft proposal. For a real-time mission transparency system, the language was clean, technical, clinical, but at the bottom, someone had included a clause. Field survivor review required for all contractor field simulations involving combat personnel. She saw her name next to it, Callahan Clause. She set the tablet down, leaned back. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was reshaping still. The old dreams didn't leave. Some nights, she woke in cold sweats, Malik's voice screaming her name, the jungle, the sound of bullets against leaves. The moment the first mine exploded, but now, when she woke, she reached for her tablet, not her weapon. This fight was different, but it was hers now, and she was finally winning. What does it feel like to change the rules that once nearly destroyed you? 6 months after Eva first raised her voice inside the Naval Review Board, the Pentagon released its most sweeping internal reforms in decades at the top of the policy. Revisions, stamped in black ink, signed by the Secretary of Defense, was a new operational safeguard. The Callahan Clause, it was simple. Mandatory field agent review before any live mission involving private contractor technology. No exceptions, no rubber stamps. A soldier's signature could now halt an operation if projected risks exceeded combat thresholds. It wasn't flashy, but it was real. Ava's name was on every memo, and the effects rippled fast. For the first time in modern military history, whistleblower protections for active field officers were expanded. Internal simulation logs from defense contractors were now subject to direct audits. Every mission request that passed through Naval Intelligence bore a stamp that read, "Reviewed per Joint Ethics Protocol, Callahan Clause Enforcement." But beyond the reforms, something else changed, something deeper, culture. For years, policy rooms had made decisions without soldiers. In them, analysts, generals, civilian consultants, they spoke about war, not from it. Now they couldn't ignore her. Ava had become more than a name, more than a survivor. She was now an institutional voice. She still wore the uniform, not for rank, for principle. One evening, after a debriefing with NATO ethics delegates, Ava stood alone in a Pentagon hallway. A digital wall display cycled through the names and faces of fallen heroes. Her fingers hovered above one photo. Her old team, Walker, Diaz, Franks, Kim, Ree. She whispered their names like a prayer. They weren't statistics. They weren't losses. They were the reason she never stopped speaking. Footsteps approached. She didn't turn. "I heard the NATO brief went well," said a familiar voice behind her. Admiral Lee. He looked older now. His eyes carried weight, but his presence was as solid as ever. Eva nodded. They listened. "That's all you ever wanted." She smiled faintly. "No, I wanted them to understand." He stepped beside her, watching the screen. "You gave them something they couldn't ignore, a truth no one could explain away." She lowered her gaze. "I thought I'd feel lighter after all this." "You won," he said. She turned to him, voice low. "Winning doesn't bring them back." "No," he said, "but it keeps others from joining them too soon." Weeks later, Eva was invited to speak at the U.S. Naval Academy. It was a rare honor and a calculated risk. The auditorium was packed. Rows of cadets in crisp dress uniforms sat stiff-backed, whispering. When Eva stepped up to the podium, they quieted. She didn't open with a speech. She didn't even touch the prepared remarks in front of her. She looked at the room, took a breath. "You'll hear a lot about glory," she began. "About sacrifice, about patriotism." She let the silence stretch. "What they won't always tell you," she continued, "is how to survive what you lose, or how to speak when you're told to stay silent." No one moved. She placed her left hand over her ribs. "This," she said, "was meant to be forgotten, but it became the loudest part of my story." Her voice didn't shake. It rang with precision. Truth, resonance. I stand here not because I was the strongest. I stand here because I couldn't walk away, knowing I had a voice others didn't. You won't always be believed. She looked across the sea of young faces. But speak anyway. The ones who matter. We'll hear you. Silence, then. Thunderous applause. That night, dozens of cadets approached her. They didn't ask for autographs. They asked questions. How do I lead through fear? How do I fight when I'm alone? How do I make sure I don't become the kind of officer who forgets the cost? Ava didn't offer perfect answers. She offered honesty, and sometimes that was enough. In the months that followed, Ava became a fixture in military publications, defense panels, even civilian conferences on ethics in AI warfare. She never sought attention, but her presence shifted every room she entered. Not for fame, for impact. She still visited the veterans. Hospital once a week, not out of obligation, out of ritual, out of respect. She brought chessboards and poetry books, sat beside amputees and burn victims, talked about anything but the war. One day, a young soldier, missing both legs, just 19, asked her, "Do you ever feel like you didn't come back whole?" She paused, then answered gently, "I didn't. But what I brought back was more useful than the pieces I lost." On the anniversary of Operation Haidorch, she returned to the jungle. She went with Malik Bennett and a small team from the memorial. The vision, the extraction site, was almost unrecognizable. The trees had grown back. The earth had smoothed over its wounds. But Eva felt it still, underfoot, in the air. The pain was still there. They planted a flag, said the names aloud: Walker, Diaz, Franks, Kim, Ree. After a long silence, Malik turned to her. "You think you'll ever stop fighting?" Ava shook her head. "Not while someone out there still thinks silence is safer." A year to the day since she stood in front of Admiral Lee and showed him her scars. A bronze plaque was mounted at the Naval History Museum. It bore no picture. No quote from a speech, just words. She spoke when silence was demanded. She stood when others fell. And she bore her scars not as wounds, but as warnings that saved countless more. Below the inscription, Lieutenant Ava Callahan, somewhere far from Washington, somewhere in the jungle that once tried to bury her, a single flag waved above the treetops, defiantly unbroken. How do you lead when even your truth becomes political? Months after the Callahan Clause reshaped domestic military policy, Ava found herself staring at a new battlefield, one without mud, without gunfire, but no less dangerous. NATO. A multinational ethics council had been formed in response to growing concerns about AI warfare and third-party contractor overreach. And they didn't just invite Eva. They needed her, because her scars didn't just speak, they warned. The conference was hosted inside a cold, glass building in Brussels. Translators sat behind glass booths. Defense ministers sipped tea. Engineers displayed flowcharts of autonomous decision trees. Ava stood in the middle of it, silent, watching. She had reviewed hundreds of mission briefs, flown across oceans, walked into rooms full of medals and rank, and watched grown men fall silent when she spoke. But this one was different. Here, the stakes weren't her own. They were everyone's. During the opening session, a British analyst presented a model that used satellite behavior to anticipate field trauma conditions. The language was neat, clinical, a mathematical way to describe human breakdown. Eva listened until he finished, then raised her hand. If your system predicts trauma, why not build protocols to stop it before it happens? He blinked. I'm sorry? You're optimizing for failure survivability, she said. Why not optimize for prevention? The room was quiet. She pushed further. You can measure a soldier's stress index, but you can't quantify what it costs them to come home with pieces missing, physically or morally. Stop using trauma as a variable. Start treating it like a red line. A German officer nodded slowly. She's right. From that point on, Eva wasn't just a contributor, she was a catalyst. Each evening, she returned to her hotel exhausted, her ribs sore from hours of sitting straight. The cold European air made her scars tighten. But she didn't complain. Instead, she opened her tablet. More proposals, more models. She marked each one not just with red ink, but with memories. When they say, acceptable risk, what does that mean for the man who loses his legs? When they say, low probability loss, who decides which family gets the folded flag? She wrote margins full of questions they didn't want to ask. But now, they couldn't avoid them. Her work began to reshape not just procedure, but language. Terms like ethical override, field line autonomy, and survivor-informed input systems entered the lexicon. Her name wasn't always attached, but her fingerprints were on every page. Back in D.C., journalists caught wind of her continued influence. Defense panels featured her on background. One civilian strategist wrote, "Lieutenant Callahan isn't reforming the military. She's rebuilding its conscience." She hated that line, not because it wasn't true, but because it wasn't fair. She never asked to be a symbol. She just didn't want anyone else to bleed for a spreadsheet again. But the more she spoke, the more attention she drew. And not all of it was support. There were whispers now. Emails leaked. Some officers, high-ranking, began to push back. They accused her of being a media darling, of compromising operational secrecy, of opening the door for emotional politics to infiltrate military discipline. One op-ed headline read, "When soldiers start setting strategy, national security suffers." Eva didn't respond. She didn't have to. The next day, during a classified ethics session inside the Pentagon, one of those same officers was seated across from her. Vice Admiral Breck. He watched her coolly, arms folded. "You've made waves, Lieutenant," he said. "Some of us are concerned about the precedent. Emotional weight doesn't make good policy." Eva didn't blink. Neither does pretending soldiers are numbers. He leaned forward, voice sharp. "The military runs on order, not sentiment. On execution, not morality." She met his gaze, calm, clear. "If you can't separate execution from morality," she said, "you're just following orders. And we've seen where that leads." Silence fell like a dropped pin. He didn't reply, because he couldn't. Later that night, Eva returned to her apartment. She pulled off her uniform, stood in front of the mirror, and traced the outline of her ribs. The scars looked the same, but they no longer felt the same. They used to remind her of pain. Now, they reminded her of why she kept fighting. That same week, she received a classified communication from Langston's office. A new threat had emerged. A contractor was lobbying to fast-track a next-gen simulation system that would bypass field review entirely. Eva read the details. Buried in the footnotes, she saw Orion Systems, rebranded. Different name. Same players. Same tactics. Langston called her in personally. "We can kill the proposal," he said. "But it'll get ugly. The money's deep. And they'll come for you." Eva didn't hesitate. "Then let them come." Langston raised a brow. "You're not tired of fighting?" She shook her head. "I'm tired of pretending the fight ever ended." 3 days later, she was back in front of a Senate subcommittee. This time, the hearing was public, televised. The room was lined with press, policy aides, defense tech reps. Eva sat at the witness table. No notes, no prepared remarks. She looked directly into the camera. And spoke. "I'm not here to tell you that technology is the enemy. It's not. I'm here to tell you that when we hand our judgment to machines, or to the companies that build them, we lose more than control. We lose conscience." She tapped her ribs lightly. "I carry 2 pieces of metal inside me that no machine predicted. They're still there. And I don't want another soldier to be told it's just part of the cost." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to, because the room and the country was listening. What happens after the fight is finally yours to shape. 6 weeks after Ava sent testimony, the military quietly killed the Orion-backed proposal. No press conference, no signatures on TV, but the silence spoke volumes. Ava had become too credible to ignore and too visible to erase. For the first time in decades, the Pentagon added a standing seat to its Advanced Weapons Oversight Council, a field operations liaison with veto authority on live deployment strategies involving autonomous systems. That seat now belonged to Lieutenant Eva Callahan. She was one of the youngest officers ever to hold it. She still wore the uniform, but not as a reminder of rank, as a reminder of responsibility. Her days were no longer filled with tactical drills or jungle treks. Instead, she sat in polished glass rooms with generals and policy architects, reviewing future wars before they ever happened. But at night, she still returned to old habits. She ran her fingers over the edges of her scars, traced their angles, not out of pain, but memory. These weren't injuries, they were landmarks. Each line, each nerve-dulled ridge, proof of something that tried to destroy her and failed. One evening, she was called to a closed-door NATO briefing on joint ethics enforcement. When she arrived, Admiral Lee was already there. He looked older than she remembered, his hair more gray, shoulders more sloped, but his presence immovable as ever. "I heard the NATO brief went well," he said. Eva gave a tired smile. "They listened. That's all you ever wanted." "No," she said. "I wanted them to understand." He nodded, then turned toward a display of digital names, fallen soldiers from multinational operations. She stood beside him. "They gave you a bigger room," she said, quietly. "They had to," he replied. "Too many names." She looked at him, voice low. "It's still happening, isn't it? Quiet missions, buried losses, the same old ghosts." He nodded again, but fewer than before. They stood in silence. Then he said something unexpected. "You gave them something they couldn't manufacture, a truth that couldn't be spun." Ava looked down. "I thought I'd feel lighter." "You won," he said. She turned to him. "Winning doesn't bring them back." "No," he said softly, "but it keeps others from joining them too soon." Later that month, she received a request from the Naval Academy. They wanted her to speak again, this time to the graduating class. The theme, leadership under fire. She hesitated. She didn't like stages, didn't like being a symbol, but she said yes, because someone needed to say it, and she was tired of silence winning. The auditorium was full. Hundreds of cadets sat in pressed blues, fresh brass on their chests, young, eager, unscarred. Eva stepped up to the podium. No teleprompter, no aids. Just a deep breath. "And truth. You'll be told leadership is about strength," she began, "about making the hard calls, standing firm." She paused, looked across the room. "They won't always tell you about the silence that follows, the moments after the dust settles, when the metals don't weigh enough to balance what you lost." She placed a hand over her ribs. "This," she said, "was never part of the plan. I wasn't supposed to come back. And when I did, the system wanted me quiet." She let the silence settle, then continued. "But I didn't survive to be quiet. I survived so others wouldn't have to carry what I did, alone." She looked at each row, each face. "You won't always be believed, but speak anyway. You won't always be followed, but walk anyway. Because someday, when someone's looking for the first hand to raise, the first voice to break protocol, it needs to be yours." Thunderous applause followed, but she didn't smile. She just nodded, once mission complete. That evening, she visited the Veterans Center one last time before deployment to her new international role. She found Malik Bennett out back, sitting beneath a tree with his service dog. He was quieter now, moved slower, but when he saw her, his smile was still full of fire. "You spoke at the academy," he said. "I caught the live stream." Iva smirked. "Did I sound old?" "You sounded honest," he said. "That's rarer." She sat beside him, handed him a small silver pin. He looked at it. "The Integrity Star," he said. She nodded. "There's more than one now. They're giving them to those who testify, who hold the line." He held it in his palm. "You ever think we'd see this day?" "Not even once," she said. He turned to her, voice low. "You ever stop carrying it?" She didn't need to ask what he meant. "No," she said, "but it feels lighter now." They sat in silence, the kind that heals. A week later, Eva boarded a flight for Geneva. Her new post, Strategic Oversight Liaison for the International Defense Coalition. She would review joint war exercises, audit third-party tech integrations, and write doctrine from inside the systems she once feared. And if it ever forgot again, she would remind it, not with speeches, but with scars. As the plane ascended into the clouds, she stared out the window. Far below, the ocean churned. Somewhere beneath those waves were places that would never make it on the maps. Places where soldiers bled without answers. Places like the jungle. She pressed her hand gently against her side. The pain was still there, but it no longer screamed. It whispered, "Keep going." A year to the day after her first testimony, a bronze plaque was installed inside the Defense Ethics Council chamber in Washington. No photograph, no anthem, just words. She stood not because it was safe. She spoke not because it was allowed. She remembered, even when others tried to forget. And in remembering, she changed everything below it. Lieutenant Eva Callahan. And miles away, in a jungle that once tried to silence her, a single flag fluttered from a high branch. Nailed to the bark of a tree no one had marked. It bore no name, just a single symbol, unbroken.